I wore my Apple Watch to lunch with my mom and my stepmother at a small diner on Greenville Avenue in Dallas, Texas. It was a Sunday, the kind of day that should have been calm and ordinary, the kind of day when you expect pancakes, coffee, and maybe a smile across the table. I thought it was just another family meal I could survive by keeping quiet and pretending everything was normal. It was not. My stepmother Cheryl noticed the watch on my wrist the moment I set my hand on the table. Her eyes narrowed and her lips pressed together into that thin line I had come to dread since I was 12 years old. My mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting between us, but she said nothing. Cheryl's voice cut through the chatter of the diner. "What is that on your wrist, Maddie? Why are you wearing that? Do you think I do not know what you are trying to do?" Her voice carried across the tables, and people turned their heads for a second before going back to their meals as if none of this concerned them. I felt the familiar heat of shame crawl up my neck. I tried to say calmly that it was just a watch, a gift from a friend at school, nothing more. Cheryl's chair scraped back against the tiled floor with a screech that made my heart pound harder. She stood up, grabbed my wrist so tightly I thought her nails might cut into my skin, and hissed, "You are coming with me now." I looked at my mom silently, begging for her to intervene, but she stared down at her coffee as if it had answers written in the cream. Cheryl yanked me out of the booth, and I stumbled behind her through the diner while the waitress pretended not to see us. The glass door banged open as she dragged me into the bright parking lot. The Texas sun was harsh, reflecting off the hoods of cars, and everything around me felt too sharp, too exposed. I barely had time to pull my wrist free when Cheryl turned her face red with fury, and she slapped me across the mouth so hard that I staggered back against a car. Pain exploded on my lip, and I tasted the sharp tang of blood. My eyes blurred not just from the sting, but from the sudden rush of humiliation. Out here in public, in the open, where anyone could see she had finally crossed the line from cruel words at home to violence under the sun. I pressed my hand to my mouth, staring at her in disbelief, while she leaned close and whispered, "You better learn to shut up before you ruin everything." I could hear my own breathing shaky and uneven, louder than the traffic rolling by on Greenville Avenue. And at that exact moment, something inside me shifted. For years, I had been trapped in silence, enduring hiding, wishing my mother would save me. But now, the blood on my lip and the heat in my chest told me that silence was no longer enough. Have you ever been in a moment where proof could change everything? Tell me in the comments what you would do, because what happened next changed the course of my entire life. My name is Madison Walker, though most people call me Maddie. I am 19 years old and a nursing student at the University of Texas at Arlington. On the surface, my life looks like any other young college student. I live in a dorm room with a roommate who spends half her nights studying and the other half streaming movies until sunrise. I work part-time at a coffee shop near campus where I pull endless espresso shots and listen to customers talk about everything from football to family drama. To the people around me, I seem like a normal girl juggling classes and work, smiling politely and nodding at all the right moments. But underneath that surface, there is a storm that has been building for years. My father passed away when I was 10. His death left a silence in our house that never really healed. For a while, it was just me and my mom, Sandra, trying to piece together a life out of grief and bills. She worked long hours, and I tried to be the good daughter who never complained. Then when I was 12, Cheryl Brenner appeared. At first, she seemed like a savior, a woman who wanted to support my mom, a strong figure who smiled at church gatherings and asked me about school. People whispered how lucky my mom was to find someone who cared. But inside our home, the reality was very different. Cheryl brought rules that felt like shackles. No locked doors, no friends without approval, no voice unless it was in agreement with hers. I learned quickly that the smile she wore in public was only a mask. In private, her tone cut sharper than knives. By the time I reached high school, she had turned every corner of the house into her territory. She managed what I wore, who I spoke to, even how late I could stay up to finish homework. If I earned a 93 on an exam, she would tell me that weakness shows. My mom rarely defended me. She said Cheryl just wanted the best for me. I clung to that sentence for years, even as it broke me down. Dallas looked bright from the outside, neon lights and busy streets, but inside that little house, the shadows never left. At the university, I carry myself as though nothing is wrong. I smile when my professors call on me in class. I nod when classmates invite me to study groups, and I joke with coworkers at the coffee shop when the line stretches out the door. But beneath that exterior is the weight of a home that has never felt safe. My dorm room has become more than a place to sleep. It is a sanctuary where Cheryl's voice cannot reach me, and where I can finally breathe without waiting for her criticism. Still, I cannot escape the reminders of her control. Every phone call from my mother makes my stomach twist. I never know if Cheryl will grab the phone from her listening for any words she can twist against me. When I visit home for weekends, I feel like a guest in my own space, walking on eggshells in rooms that used to be mine. The house is filled with Cheryl's presence. She redecorated the living room, hung family portraits that barely include me, and told the neighbors how grateful she is to raise such a perfect blended family. They believe her. At church, people greet her warmly and tell me how blessed I am to have her as a role model. I smile back, but inside I want to scream that they do not see the truth. Dallas is a big city filled with lights and noise, yet sometimes I feel invisible. I pass restaurants full of laughter couples strolling arm in arm, children running across parks, and I wonder how many of them are also hiding bruises that do not always show on skin. When I lie awake at night in my dorm, I think about my father and wonder what he would say if he saw what has become of us. Would he tell me to fight back? Would he remind me that I am stronger than Cheryl wants me to believe? I tell myself I study nursing not only to build a future for me, but also to learn how to heal wounds, even the invisible ones. The truth is, I am tired of silence. Each day that passes makes me more certain that there will come a time when I cannot just endure. Something will break, and when it does, the world will finally see what life with Cheryl has really been. It was a Sunday morning when the message from my mom appeared on my phone. Lunch at Norma's Cafe, Greenville Avenue. Cheryl insists, please come. I stared at the words for a long time. Every part of me wanted to ignore it to stay in my dorm room with my textbooks and the smell of coffee grounds still clinging to my clothes from work. But my mom's voice, even through a text, still carried that pleading tone I knew too well. She was asking me to keep the peace, to be the bridge, to sacrifice my comfort, so she would not face Cheryl's anger alone. Against my better judgment, I typed back that I would be there. The drive down to Greenville Avenue was filled with dread. The Dallas skyline glittered in the distance, but I barely saw it. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, my mind replaying old scenes of dinners gone wrong and family gatherings that ended in icy silence. I parked outside the diner, a place known for pies and friendly waitresses, a place that should have felt warm and ordinary. Instead, I sat in the car for a full minute, breathing hard, trying to summon the strength to walk in. When I finally pushed through the glass door, the familiar smell of fried food and coffee hit me. My mom was already seated at a booth by the window. Cheryl beside her, arms crossed expression, sharp even in the soft light of the diner. My mom gave me a small smile, the kind that looked more like an apology than a welcome. I slid into the booth across from them, trying to steady my heartbeat. A waitress poured water into our glasses and left us with menus we would never really look at. Cheryl's eyes moved instantly to my wrist. The Apple Watch caught the light, a simple band with a digital face, but in that moment it felt like a loaded weapon. Her lips curved into a smirk that made my stomach sink. She leaned forward just enough for her words to cut through the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversations around us. Recording me, are you? The question hung in the air like smoke, choking every breath I tried to take. I shook my head quickly, whispering that it was just a watch, just a gift, nothing more. But Cheryl's eyes locked on me the way a predator fixes on prey. My mom reached for her coffee cup, pretending to sip her hand, trembling just enough for me to notice. Cheryl leaned back against the booth, her voice rising louder, now sharp enough that nearby tables glanced over before quickly returning to their plates. I know exactly what you are doing, Maddie. You think you can make me look bad. You think you can twist things. Her tone carried not just accusation, but triumph, as if she had caught me in a crime. My face burned. I wanted to sink into the vinyl seat and disappear. The waitress hesitated nearby with a coffee pot, then turned away without a word. That was the part that hurt almost as much as Cheryl's anger, the way strangers saw and chose to ignore. I whispered again that it was only a watch, but Cheryl's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. The sound made me jump. She reached across the table, her hand gripping my wrist, squeezing so hard that pain shot through my arm. "Come with me. Now." Her voice was low but dangerous, a command I had learned never to disobey. I looked at my mom, pleading silently for her to intervene. Her eyes dropped to the table. She stirred sugar into her coffee that was already sweet enough. My chest tightened as Cheryl yanked me out of the booth. The chatter of the diner continued, forks clinking against plates, conversations carrying on as though I was invisible, as though a 19-year-old girl being dragged through the room was nothing worth noticing. My shoes slipped against the tiled floor as she pulled me past the counter and toward the door. The bell above it jingled cheerfully as we stepped into the sunlight. The bright Texas sky felt merciless, the heat pressing against my skin while Cheryl's grip only tightened. The parking lot stretched wide and blinding in the noon sun, rows of cars shimmering under the Texas heat. Cheryl didn't stop until we were shielded between two pickups hidden from most of the diners inside. She shoved me back against the side of a dusty SUV, the impact rattling through my shoulder. Her face hovered inches from mine, her breath hot with fury. "You think you can record me, make me look like a monster?" Her voice cut like glass. My heart raced so fast I could hear it in my ears, the pulse a frantic drumbeat I couldn't control. I tried to say again that the watch wasn't recording anything, but the words barely left my mouth before her hand came up fast and sharp. The slap cracked across my cheek so loud I wondered if the entire block had heard it. Pain burst through my face and I tasted copper at the corner of my lip. For a moment, the world tilted. The blue sky, the blinding sun, the endless stretch of asphalt spun as if gravity had betrayed me. Cheryl's eyes glowed with satisfaction, the kind that comes from proving a point, no matter how cruel. "Now you know better," she hissed. "You will keep quiet, you will respect this family, and you will never challenge me again." Her hand finally released my wrist, leaving angry red marks where her nails had dug into my skin. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stand straight, not giving her the victory of seeing me collapse. Behind us, a family walked past quickly, a father holding his daughter's hand, the mother whispering something urgent as they hurried away. They had seen, they knew, but they didn't stop. No one ever stopped. Cheryl adjusted her blouse, smoothed her hair, and gave me one last hard look before striding back toward the diner. "Fix your face," she muttered over her shoulder. "You look pathetic." I pressed my palm against my cheek, feeling the sting, the swelling, the proof written in pain across my skin. My watch buzzed gently against my wrist, recording heart rate spikes I didn't yet understand. In that moment, I didn't know it had captured everything. When I was 12 years old, I still believed in rescue stories. My father had been gone for 2 years by then, a sudden illness that left me and Mom clinging to each other in our small house in East Dallas. She worked 2 jobs, one at a dental office during the day and a retail shift at night, and every evening I'd wait by the window until the headlights of her old Honda appeared. We ate late dinners of macaroni or cereal, laughing, sometimes crying others, but always together. That version of Mom felt real and close, the kind of parent who braided my hair before school and whispered prayers over me before bed. Then Cheryl arrived. She came into our lives like a polished answer to problems we hadn't solved, a woman with perfect posture, perfect teeth, and a voice that carried authority even when she was smiling. Mom met her through a fitness class in Plano, and within months, Cheryl was coming over for dinners, fixing leaky faucets, offering advice about everything from homework to posture. At first, I thought she was nice. She called me sweetheart, brought me protein bars for lunch, and told me she was impressed by how smart I was. I wanted to believe her. I wanted Mom to have someone steady, someone who could ease the constant weight she carried. At their wedding, Cheryl put a hand on my shoulder during photos and whispered that she would take care of us now. I smiled for the camera, believing those words. The changes began small. I couldn't close my bedroom door anymore. Cheryl said it was for airflow, but really it meant I had no space that was mine. Bedtimes became rigid. 9 o'clock, no exceptions. If I complained, Cheryl would tilt her head and ask if I thought rules didn't apply to me. She spoke like a teacher handing down lessons, her voice calm but edged with something I couldn't name. By the time school started that fall, our house no longer felt like ours. It felt like Cheryl's. Mom went along with it, all her voice adopting this flat, careful tone I hadn't heard before. "She's only trying to help us, Maddie. She knows what she's doing." I clung to that reassurance, trying to convince myself Cheryl's rules meant stability. But even at 12, I could sense something slipping away. The laughter at dinner grew rare. The warmth in our home thinned like smoke. And for the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider in my own house. By the time I turned 13, the house had shifted entirely into Cheryl's domain. She moved her neatly labeled boxes into every room, lining our shelves with binders marked schedules and expenses as though family life could be managed like a corporate gym. Rules multiplied. I was no longer allowed to spend time at the library after school unless Cheryl approved. She said she needed to know exactly where I was at all times. Friends who once came over for sleepovers stopped visiting altogether. Cheryl inspected them with a sharp gaze, asking questions about their parents, their grades, their church attendance until they looked uncomfortable and made excuses not to return. When I asked why, Cheryl smiled thinly and said, "Better to know who really deserves to be around you." Privacy became something I learned to crave like oxygen. My phone calls were limited to 10 minutes, always on speaker, always with Cheryl in the room. She'd sit in her armchair with her arms crossed, listening to every word. Internet use was rationed to 1 hour on weekdays, 2 on weekends, logged in a chart she taped to the fridge. When I slipped once and stayed online past the time limit, she printed out a list of websites I had visited and read them aloud at dinner. Mom sat silently cutting chicken into tiny pieces, nodding whenever Cheryl paused for agreement. The humiliation stung worse than the restriction itself. School had once been my escape, but even there, Cheryl found ways to intrude. She demanded to see every test, every graded assignment, and if it wasn't perfect, she circled the mistakes in red pen. A 93 in math brought her scorn. "You cannot expect to succeed in life if you settle for almost," she told me, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. "Weakness shows Maddie. Weakness invites failure." I tried to laugh sometimes to push back lightly, but her eyes would narrow and she'd drop her voice until it was nearly a whisper. "Do you want to end up like your mother, exhausted and dependent, or do you want to be strong like me?" It was a trap disguised as a choice, one I learned quickly I could never win. Mom, who once defended me, started echoing Cheryl's words. "She just wants the best for you, Maddie. Don't take it so personally." Every time she said it, something inside me broke a little more. I still loved her, but I no longer trusted her to protect me. At 13, I realized that rescue stories were only that, stories. In real life, sometimes the villain moved in, unpacked her boxes, and never left. High school should have been freedom, but with Cheryl in control, it became another kind of cage. At 14, I wanted to join the debate team, mostly because it meant I could stay late after school without being under her watchful eyes. When she found out, she didn't yell. Cheryl never needed to raise her voice. Instead, she stood in the kitchen, arms folded, her tone low and deliberate. "You think you're clever. Clever girls get in trouble. Do you want to be that girl?" The silence after her words was suffocating. Mom stood at the sink scrubbing a plate that was already spotless, her shoulders rigid but her lips sealed. I understood then that no one was coming to my defense. Cheryl dictated everything down to my clothes. If I wore a shirt that was too bright, she would purse her lips and say it made me look desperate. If I laughed too loud on the phone with Rachel, my best friend since middle school, Cheryl's eyes would narrow. "Men don't respect women who cackle," she'd whisper, making the word feel like an insult carved into my skin. I started keeping a journal in secret, jotting down the comments, the rules, the way her presence seeped into every corner of my life. It was the only place I could say the truth, that I hated the way she twisted my father's memory, always invoking him as a weapon. "Your dad would be ashamed if he saw you slouching. Your dad would expect more than this grade. Your dad would want you to respect me." Those words dug deeper than any slap ever could. At school, teachers praised my focus, my grades, my ability to stay composed. They didn't know the reason I studied so hard was because mistakes meant hours of scrutiny at home. They didn't know that every A- was treated as evidence of weakness. By 16, I had learned to live in two worlds. In public, I was the respectful daughter of Sandra and Cheryl, the girl who smiled politely and seemed disciplined. At home, I was a shadow keeping my head down, speaking only when spoken to, managing survival like it was homework. But sometimes at night when the house was quiet, I'd sit by my bedroom window and imagine what it would feel like to be free, to laugh without consequence, to wear what I wanted, to have friends over without interrogation. That hope was the ember I kept hidden, the one Cheryl hadn't yet extinguished. By the time I reached 17, I had mastered invisibility. I moved through the house silently, finishing chores before Cheryl could find fault, answering her questions with short, careful phrases. Still, no matter how precise I tried to be, she always found cracks to exploit. If I spent too much time on homework, she accused me of being antisocial. If I laughed at a joke Rachel texted me, she said I was wasting time on frivolous friendships. Every part of my life became a battlefield where Cheryl set the rules and changed them whenever she pleased. College became my escape plan. I applied in secret using the computers at school so Cheryl couldn't track my searches. I prayed over those applications at night, whispering that I just needed one chance to get away. When I was accepted to the University of Texas at Arlington, my chest filled with relief so sharp it hurt. I told Mom first, hoping maybe she would smile the way she used to when Dad was alive. Instead, she glanced nervously at Cheryl before forcing out a small "Congratulations, honey." Cheryl didn't even look at me. She just said, "Discipline has its rewards. You should thank me." Her words turned my victory sour. The summer before I left for college was the hardest of all. Cheryl tightened her grip, insisting I turn over most of the money I earned from a part-time job at a diner. She claimed it was to contribute to family expenses, but I knew it was about control. When I refused 1 week, she cut off my phone service without warning. Mom handed me her phone quietly that night, whispering that she would cover me until I left. It was the first hint of resistance I had seen from her in years, and it broke my heart as much as it comforted me. The night before I moved into the dorms, Cheryl sat me down at the dining table. She leaned close, her voice low and steady. "Do not think leaving here makes you free. You are who I made you." Those words burned in my chest as I packed the last of my things. Stepping onto the UTA campus for the first time felt like breathing after years underwater. Yet even as I settled into the dorms, even as I started a new life, Cheryl's voice lived in my head. Every decision carried the echo of her judgment. Every success felt like something she would try to take credit for. I thought distance would weaken her power, but the truth was, control like hers didn't vanish. It lingered, shaping the way I flinched at sharp voices and doubted my own worth. I didn't know then that one day I'd finally hold proof against her. Back then, I was just grateful to survive. College gave me distance, but it didn't cut the tether Cheryl had wrapped around me. Every weekend, I drove from Arlington back to Dallas, telling myself it was to check on Mom, but really, it was because guilt whispered louder than freedom. Cheryl was always waiting, her smile polished in front of neighbors, and her words sharpened the moment the door shut. She insisted that since I had a scholarship and part-time job, it was only fair that I contribute to household expenses. At first, it was small $50 here, $100 there, but soon it became routine. Every paycheck I earned at the coffee shop near campus seemed to flow straight back into her hands. Mom would slip comments in like reminders from a script. "Your stepmother just wants us stable, Maddie. It's the least you can do." I wanted to scream that Cheryl wasn't my stepmother, she was my warden, but the words never left my mouth. It wasn't just money. Cheryl made sure her control stretched into the spaces I thought were mine. She asked to see my bank statements when I came home, pretending it was about teaching me financial responsibility. When I hesitated, she snapped her fingers the way she did when she expected obedience. Mom's eyes flickered with unease, but she stayed silent as always. I began to hide cash in textbooks and keep a second checking account Cheryl didn't know about. The secrecy felt dangerous, but it was the only way I could breathe. At church, Cheryl was a saint. At Preston Hollow Presbyterian, she volunteered for every event, shaking hands, baking pies, and telling anyone who would listen how proud she was of her stepdaughter in nursing school. People praised her endlessly. "You're so lucky, Maddie. She saved your family after your dad passed." I would smile tightly and excuse myself, my stomach twisting at the hypocrisy. Because behind those Sunday compliments lay Saturday nights filled with Cheryl's endless criticisms, her voice hissing that I laughed too loud, that I was selfish for keeping money when the house needed repairs, that I should be grateful for all she had done. The pressure built in quiet ways. My textbooks grew heavier, not from pages, but from the weight of hidden envelopes of cash. My heart rate spiked whenever my phone buzzed with a text from Mom, knowing it would be another request disguised as necessity. The A's I earned at UTA felt hollow because I knew Cheryl would claim them as proof of her methods. She twisted every success into her victory, every mistake into evidence of my weakness. The walls of the campus dorm should have been my sanctuary, but even there her shadow followed. I told myself I could endure it, that once I graduated and became a nurse, I would finally sever the strings she pulled. But Cheryl was tightening her grip, preparing for the moment she believed I might slip away. And deep down, I knew she would not let me go without a fight. The money became the language of control, and Cheryl spoke it fluently. When I was 19, she discovered the small savings account I had opened in my own name. I had been so careful, depositing just enough each week to stay under her radar. But one evening during dinner, Cheryl laid a bank statement on the table with my name printed at the top. Her smile was razor thin as she slid it toward me. "What exactly are you hiding, Maddie?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Mom's eyes darted to the paper and then to me, but she said nothing. Cheryl tapped the page with one perfectly manicured nail. "You live under this roof. That means transparency. Secrets are for liars." I wanted to scream that I was an adult, that I had a right to privacy, but my voice failed me. Instead, I muttered that it was for emergencies. Cheryl leaned back, her laugh soft but cutting. "You want emergencies? Try the roof leaking. Try the car needing repairs. Try the bills that keep this house standing. That is an emergency, Maddie. You will contribute." That night, I withdrew half of the account to hand over. The other half I moved to a new hiding place in cash. The humiliation burned deeper than the loss of money. It was the realization that no matter how far I ran, Cheryl would always find ways to reel me back. Mom whispered in the kitchen later, "Thank you for helping. Cheryl just wants us safe." I stared at her, aching for the woman who used to braid my hair and tell me bedtime stories. She was gone, replaced by someone who repeated Cheryl's lines as if they were scripture. By then, Cheryl's influence in the community had cemented. She was promoted to manager at a high-end gym in Plano, plastering her smile on billboards and Instagram ads. Clients adored her discipline and drive. Women said they wanted to be like her men, praised her leadership. No one saw the way she weaponized that same discipline at home. No one knew how often I sat in my dorm room staring at my phone, dreading the next demand for money. I began documenting everything. I took photos of the notes Cheryl taped to the fridge listing rules for me, even when I wasn't living there full-time. I saved texts from Mom asking for money for utilities for car payments, always ending with "Cheryl says it's urgent." It became my quiet rebellion, my private record of truth. I didn't know yet what I would do with the evidence, only that keeping it made me feel less powerless. But Cheryl sensed the shift. She started checking my wrist when I visited her eyes, flicking to my watch, my phone, my laptop. "What are you recording, Maddie?" She asked it like a joke, but the way her eyes hardened told me she wasn't laughing. Her suspicion grew sharper with each visit, and I felt the storm building. It was only a matter of time before she struck harder than words. The more Cheryl tightened her grip, the more determined I became to resist, though my resistance had to be subtle, almost invisible. I learned to smile during church service while slipping small victories into my pocket. I kept a burner phone hidden in my dorm room drawer, bought with cash from extra shifts at the coffee shop. On it, I stored copies of screenshots, photos of Cheryl's rules, even recordings of her voice when she slipped into one of her tirades. Each file felt like a piece of armor I was building slowly, a shield against her. Rachel, my best friend, was the only one I trusted enough to share these fragments with. One night in the library, she leaned across the table, her voice low. "Maddie, this is evidence. You have to save this. One day it might matter." Her certainty gave me a flicker of strength I hadn't felt in years. Cheryl, however, had instincts like a hunter. She sensed when I pulled away, even in the smallest ways. If I didn't answer her texts immediately, she would call my mom and demand to know where I was. If I didn't come home for a weekend, she accused me of abandoning the family. The accusations grew louder, more public. At church, she once clasped my shoulder and announced to a group of women, "Maddie is learning discipline, though she still struggles with honesty." They laughed lightly, thinking it was a joke, while I stood there frozen, humiliated. Money remained her favorite weapon. She demanded that I give her the tips I earned at the cafe, saying they were unreported income that could be put to better use for the household. When I refused, once she cut off access to the family Netflix account, mocking me for acting entitled. It was petty, but the pettiness stung because it reminded me she controlled even the smallest comforts. The pressure began to seep into my health. Sleepless nights left me dragging through classes. Headaches became constant, a dull throb that followed me everywhere. I started to worry that Cheryl was right, that maybe I was weak, maybe I wasn't strong enough to break free. That fear haunted me every time I looked in the mirror. But underneath the exhaustion was a growing ember of anger. For years, I had swallowed her words, buried the shame, accepted the control. Now each demand, each humiliation added fuel to a fire I could no longer ignore. Rachel's reminders that I wasn't crazy, that what Cheryl was doing was abuse, kept that fire alive. I didn't know when it would ignite, but I could feel it building. The tension between us became so sharp that even Mom couldn't ignore it. One evening, she whispered while Cheryl was upstairs, "Please stop provoking her, Maddie. Just keep the peace." Her plea wasn't protection, it was surrender. And I realized then that I could not count on my mother to save me. If there was going to be a way out, I would have to create it myself. By the time spring semester of my sophomore year began, the tension with Cheryl felt like a taut wire ready to snap. Every visit home was a performance where I played the role of dutiful daughter while she sharpened her suspicions. She had begun to demand my phone the moment I walked through the door, scrolling through my messages under the guise of concern. I learned to keep my real conversations on the burner phone hidden in my dorm and let her find only harmless group chats about homework or campus events. But no matter how careful I was, her eyes lingered on my watch whenever I lifted a glass or checked the time. That constant gaze made me hyper-aware, like a criminal hiding evidence even when I had done nothing wrong. The financial pressure escalated further. Cheryl declared that because I was now officially an adult, I should be responsible for contributing to the mortgage. The idea was absurd. My part-time cafe wages could barely cover textbooks and groceries, but she framed it as duty. "Do you think the world cares that you are young, Maddie? Bills do not wait." She delivered the line in front of Mom, who nodded along, though her face looked drawn and pale. I wanted to shout that it wasn't my responsibility, that Cheryl's gym salary could more than cover their bills, but I knew it would be useless. Instead, I began to work more hours, stacking shifts back to back until exhaustion became routine. The hypocrisy was unbearable. At Preston Hollow Presbyterian, Cheryl spoke during a community event about empowering young women. She praised disciplined self-control and the importance of family unity. People applauded and I stood in the crowd, my lip caught between my teeth to keep from screaming. To them, she was a model of strength. To me, she was the hand squeezing tighter around my throat every day. One night, I returned to the dorm after a late shift and Rachel was waiting with 2 cups of hot chocolate. She looked at me and said simply, "Maddie, you can't keep living like this." Her voice cracked as she reminded me that abuse wasn't always fists and bruises. Sometimes it was control, manipulation, fear. Her words echoed in my head as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. She was right. I had been documenting for years, but I hadn't yet found the courage to act. That courage would come unexpectedly. Because as much as Cheryl had convinced herself she controlled every move I made, she overlooked one simple truth. Technology keeps records. And the very watch she feared so much, the one she glared at every time I lifted my wrist, would become the key that unlocked everything she tried to bury. The slap in the parking lot should have been just another moment of humiliation, one more memory I buried alongside all the others. But as I stood there with my cheek burning and the taste of blood in my mouth, my watch buzzed gently against my wrist. At first, I thought it was just the heart rate monitor reacting to my racing pulse. Later, back in my dorm room, I realized it had recorded the sound, the sharp crack of Cheryl's hand against my face, my gasp, her hissed threat telling me to shut up before I ruined everything. I sat frozen, staring at the file, my fingers trembling as I hit play again and again. The evidence I had dreamed of holding, the proof I thought I would never have, was right there, stored in a tiny device strapped to my wrist. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For years, it had been my word against hers, a teenager against the respected gym manager, the beloved church volunteer. People nodded politely when I hinted at the truth, but their eyes always said they doubted me. Now, for once, it wasn't just my word. It was sound, undeniable, raw. I called Rachel that night, my voice shaking as I told her. She insisted I send her a copy immediately. Maddie. She said, her voice steady in a way mine wasn't. This changes everything. This is not just survival anymore. This is your chance. For hours, I paced the dorm room. Fear battled against hope inside me. What if Cheryl found out I had the file? What if she turned it against me somehow? But then I remembered the look on her face in the parking lot, the confidence that no one would stop her, the certainty that she could hurt me without consequence. That memory lit a spark. For the first time, the power wasn't only hers. For the first time, I had something she couldn't twist. The next morning, I sat in the campus library staring at the screen of my laptop, the recording file open like a secret I was almost afraid to touch. Around me, students flipped through textbooks and typed essays, their lives filled with normal worries about exams and deadlines. Mine had narrowed to one choice: bury this file or use it. My chest tightened at the thought of Cheryl discovering it, of her marching into my dorm with that cold smile and tearing everything away. But another thought pressed harder. If I let this moment pass, I would always remain her prisoner. Rachel met me there, dropping her backpack onto the chair beside me. She listened to the recording, once her face pale but resolute. Maddie, this is proof. You cannot let her keep controlling you. You have to take this to someone who will listen. My instinct was to shake my head, to retreat into the familiar safety of silence. But Rachel leaned forward, her voice firm. Do you want to spend the rest of your life hiding? Because that is what she wants. Her words cut through the fog in my mind. For years, I had been documenting quietly, saving texts and photos, but none of it felt powerful enough. This was different. This was undeniable. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as if it burned. I whispered, "What if no one believes me?" Rachel's eyes held mine. They will. That night, I copied the file onto a flash drive and slipped it into my backpack as though it were a precious jewel. Every step across campus felt heavier, like I was carrying not just evidence, but the possibility of freedom. I didn't tell Mom. I knew she would beg me to keep the peace to protect Cheryl's image. Instead, I told myself that if my father were alive, he would want me to fight. He would want me to finally break the silence. 2 days later, I sat in a quiet office in downtown Dallas, the hum of traffic outside, faint through the tall windows. Across from me was Marissa Hale, a lawyer Rachel's cousin had recommended. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed, dressed in a navy suit that radiated authority. My palms sweated as I slid the flash drive across her desk. I half expected her to dismiss me, to tell me I was overreacting, just like so many adults had done before. Instead, she plugged it in, clicked the file, and listened. The sound of Cheryl's slap echoed through the speakers, followed by my cry and her chilling whisper. The room went very still. Marissa leaned back, steepling her fingers. "Maddie, this is not just a family disagreement. This is assault." Her certainty shook me. I had carried this fear for so long that hearing it named aloud felt both terrifying and liberating. She explained the options carefully. We could file for a restraining order. We could prepare a case. Texas law allowed one-party consent on recordings, which meant the evidence was admissible. Every word she said felt like a crack opening in the cage I had lived in. I thought of Cheryl's face if she heard the file played in front of others. I thought of the mask shattering the power shifting. My voice trembled as I asked, what happens if she denies it? Marissa's gaze was steady. The recording speaks louder than her denial. Leaving the office, the streets of Dallas seemed sharper, louder, as if the city itself had woken up with me. I clutched my bag, feeling the weight of possibility inside it. For once, I wasn't carrying only fear. I was carrying proof. That night in my dorm, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioner blending with the storm inside my head. For so many years, my choices had been limited to obedience or quiet resistance. Now, for the first time, there was a third path confrontation. The word itself scared me, but it also filled me with a strange sense of relief. I no longer had to wonder if anyone would believe me. I had the slap, the threat, the proof sealed in sound. I thought of Mom, how she would react when she found out. I could hear her pleading voice already begging me not to embarrass Cheryl, not to draw attention to the family. But I knew then that I could not let her fear decide my life any longer. She had chosen silence for herself. I refused to choose it for me. Rachel called just before midnight. She asked if I was still sure. Her voice was gentle, but underneath it was steel. I surprised myself with how steady my answer was. Yes, I am done hiding. The words came out like a vow. The next morning, I walked across campus with my backpack heavier than it had ever felt. I knew once I handed over the evidence officially, everything would change. Cheryl's world built on control and appearances would begin to crumble. Mine, built on silence and endurance, would finally start to rise. Fear still twisted in my chest, but it no longer felt paralyzing. It felt like fuel. When I reached the courthouse steps later that week beside Marissa, the sky was a flawless Texas blue. I took a deep breath and told myself this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of freedom. For years, Cheryl had told me I was weak. With each step up those stairs, I proved her wrong. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I imagined. Dallas County Courthouse loomed above me, its stone walls casting long shadows on the pavement. I stood at the entrance clutching my bag, my heart thudding so hard it felt like the sound might echo across the plaza. Marissa walked beside me, calm and professional, carrying her briefcase as if this were just another day in court. For me, it was the day everything would finally be dragged into the light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and paper. The courtroom itself was crowded, the benches filled with strangers whose lives had collided with the justice system in their own ways. I tried to focus on the details, the dark grain of the tables, the polished brass of the judge's bench, anything to keep my nerves from consuming me. Then the door opened and Cheryl walked in. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair pulled back in a sleek twist, her face composed into the same mask she had worn for years. My mother trailed behind her, her shoulders slumped, her eyes darting around the room as though she wanted to vanish. Cheryl's gaze landed on me, and for a moment her lips curved into a faint smile. It was the smile of someone who still believed she held all the power. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Marissa's voice was steady as she presented our case. She laid out the history of control, the financial manipulation, the constant surveillance. Cheryl shifted in her seat, shaking her head slightly, whispering into her attorney's ear. I sat frozen hands clenched in my lap, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. When Marissa played the recording, the entire room changed. The sharp crack of the slap filled the air, followed by my gasp of pain, followed by Cheryl's low voice telling me to shut up before I ruined everything. The sound seemed to reverberate against the walls, sinking into every corner. I lowered my eyes, feeling the sting on my cheek all over again. The silence afterward was heavy. Then whispers spread across the benches. Cheryl's mask faltered. She leaned forward, her face red, her mouth twisting. "That is not what it sounds like," she snapped. "She is twisting this. I never—" Her words broke off when the judge raised a hand. "The recording speaks for itself, Ms. Brenner." I dared to glance at my mother. Tears filled her eyes, but she still did not speak. That silence hurt almost more than the memory of the slap. Still, for the first time, Cheryl was not the one in control of the narrative. The truth was no longer locked in our house. It was out in the open, undeniable. Cheryl's lawyer rose quickly, trying to smooth over the damage. He spoke in polished tones about misunderstandings about families that sometimes argued about how technology could distort context. His words rolled on like a rehearsed speech, but they sounded hollow against the raw evidence still echoing in everyone's memory. Marissa stood with quiet confidence, letting him finish before she stepped forward again. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply reminded the court of what they had heard with their own ears. She pointed out that no matter how carefully Cheryl had constructed her image, the recording cut through every mask. The words, the violence, the threat, they belonged to Cheryl and no one else. The judge turned to me then, asking if I wanted to speak. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stand. My legs felt unsteady, but I gripped the edge of the table and found my voice. I told them about the years of rules that stripped me of privacy, about the humiliation of having every grade, every friend, every dollar scrutinized. I spoke about the shame of being dragged through a diner in front of strangers, about the sting of that slap, about the silence from my own mother. The words poured out in a rush, trembling but unstoppable, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. For once, I didn't try to protect Cheryl's reputation. I didn't soften the edges of the truth. Cheryl shifted in her seat, her face twisting with anger she could no longer hide. She interrupted, calling me ungrateful, a liar, a manipulator. Her voice rose higher, cracking with fury as she leaned forward. "This girl is destroying our family," she shouted. "You are all blind. You cannot see what she is doing." The courtroom buzzed with whispers again, but this time the looks were not skeptical glances toward me. They were sharp and judging stares directed at her. The judge banged the gavel, restoring order. His voice was calm but firm. "Ms. Brenner, your behavior is only confirming the concerns presented here." The words landed like a verdict before the official one was even spoken. I sat down slowly, my pulse hammering, my hands damp with sweat. For years, Cheryl's rage had been my private burden hidden behind closed doors. Now it was on display, undeniable, in a room full of witnesses. The power she had wielded for so long was slipping from her grasp, and she knew it. I could see it in the way her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, in the way her lawyer struggled to calm her. For the first time, the shame was hers to carry. The judge called for a short recess. As people stood and shuffled out, I stayed seated, my body heavy with exhaustion. Rachel slipped into the row behind me, having taken off work to be there. She touched my shoulder lightly and whispered, "You did it, Maddie. You made them hear you." Her words steadied me more than I expected. When court resumed, Marissa methodically laid out the evidence I had collected over the years. She presented the photos of Cheryl's written rules, the text messages demanding money, the emails that dripped with condescension. Each piece landed like a stone, added to the weight pressing against Cheryl. Her lawyer tried to object, claiming the documents lacked context, but the judge allowed most of it. I watched Cheryl's face as the facade crumbled. She clenched her jaw, her composure unraveling with every exhibit displayed. At one point, she muttered loudly enough for people around her to hear, "She's been planning this for years, twisting everything, poisoning everyone against me." The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she wasn't in control anymore. Then Marissa asked me one last question. "Maddie, why did you decide to bring this to court now?" The room fell silent, every eye turning toward me. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to look at the judge. Because if I stayed silent, I was giving her permission to keep hurting me, and I will not give her permission anymore. My voice wavered, but carried through the room. It was the truest thing I had ever said out loud. Cheryl's chair scraped back suddenly as she jumped to her feet, pointing at me with a shaking hand. "You're weak. You always have been weak. Without me, you'd be nothing." She spat the words across the courtroom, her voice shrill, her control shattered. Gasps rose from the benches, whispers spreading like wildfire. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, urging her to sit, but she shook him off. My mother sat beside her, pale and trembling, tears sliding down her cheeks. She whispered Cheryl's name like a plea, but Cheryl didn't hear her. The judge's gavel struck hard. "Sit down now, or you will be held in contempt." Cheryl froze, her chest heaving, then slowly lowered herself back into the chair. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen the fury, the cruelty the mask ripped away in real time. I sat straighter in my seat, not because I felt triumphant yet, but because I realized the balance of power had shifted. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking under her shadow. She was shrinking under mine. The courtroom grew so still that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the judge's bench. My hands were clammy, but I held them tight together in my lap, willing myself not to look away. The judge leaned forward, his voice measured and deliberate. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the recording, this court finds sufficient cause to issue a permanent restraining order against Ms. Cheryl Brenner. Gasps echoed through the benches, followed by a low murmur. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with the release of a weight I had carried for nearly half my life. Cheryl's face went pale, her mouth opening in shock before twisting into rage. She tried to speak, but her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, urging her to stay silent. She jerked away, whispering furiously, "This is not over! She cannot do this to me!" But the gavel struck again, silencing her. The judge's gaze was firm. "It is over in this courtroom. You will stay away from Ms. Walker. Any violation will result in immediate consequences." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My mother sat frozen, staring down at her lap as if the floor might swallow her whole. For a moment, I wanted her to look at me to say something, anything, but she never lifted her eyes. The absence of her voice was a wound sharper than Cheryl's slap. Yet even as that truth hurt, another truth grew stronger. I had survived without her protection, and I would continue to. When the judge dismissed the court, people began to rise, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking toward Cheryl as if she were some fallen idol. Rachel gripped my arm tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You are free now." The words sank into me slowly, as if my mind needed time to believe them. As we walked out of the courtroom, Cheryl's glare burned into my back, but it no longer pierced me. For once, her power had no hold. Outside, the Dallas sun blazed bright against the courthouse steps. I stood for a moment, feeling the heat on my skin, breathing in air that tasted cleaner than it had in years. The fight had been brutal, the scars would remain, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence was broken. The truth had been heard. The days after the hearing felt strangely quiet, as if the storm had finally passed, but left the air heavy with its aftermath. For the first time in years, my phone stopped buzzing with demands for money or sudden orders disguised as family responsibilities. Cheryl's name no longer appeared in my messages, and the silence was both unsettling and liberating. I half expected her to show up at my dorm pounding on the door, but the restraining order stood like a shield between us. I carried a copy folded neatly in my backpack everywhere I went, a reminder that the law, not Cheryl, now had the final word. Word spread quickly through her community. At the gym, she managed in Plano whispers replaced admiration. Clients who once praised her discipline began canceling memberships. The church that had once treated her as a pillar now avoided her name in announcements. I heard all of it through murmurs, through Rachel's updates, through articles that circulated online. The woman who had controlled every corner of my life was losing the only thing she valued more than power at home, her reputation. My mother remained with her. I wish I could say the court's decision opened her eyes, but instead she doubled down. She sent me short texts asking why I had done this, insisting Cheryl only wanted the best. I stared at the screen, the ache in my chest deepening, and sometimes I typed long replies about bruises, humiliation, fear. Then I erased them. I realized she wasn't ready to hear the truth. Maybe she never would be. Instead, I focused on building my own life. I threw myself into my nursing studies at UTA, determined not to waste the freedom I had fought for. Every textbook page I turned felt like a step forward, every late-night study session a promise to myself that the future belonged to me, not to Cheryl. At the cafe where I worked, I found myself smiling more easily at customers, no longer weighed down by the constant dread of what waited at home. Slowly, the tightness in my chest began to ease. Freedom did not come without grief. The distance between me and my mother widened until it felt like we lived in different worlds. I visited home once after the court ruling, stepping into the house that had been both my prison and my childhood refuge. Cheryl was gone for the day, but her presence lingered in every corner. The framed photos on the wall showed her smile, her arm draped around my mother's shoulders, her dominance etched into the very decor. Mom made me tea in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she set the cup down. She tried to talk about school, about work, about anything but the truth. Finally, I asked her why she stayed. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "It's easier than being alone." Those words cut deep, sharper than any slap I had ever endured. I realized then that she had chosen her comfort over my safety. She loved me, but she could not protect me, and maybe she never would. Leaving that house for the last time was like closing the door on a version of myself that had been waiting too long for rescue. I walked out carrying only a small box of old photos and a quilt my grandmother had made. The rest of it, the silence, the fear, the broken trust, I left behind. Back on campus, I started piecing together a new rhythm. I joined a study group in my nursing program, finding friends who knew nothing of Cheryl's shadow and only saw me as Maddie, the girl who worked hard and laughed easily once she relaxed. At night, I journaled not about rules or humiliations, but about goals, the hospital I wanted to work at, the kind of nurse I wanted to be, the freedom I wanted to live every day. Still some nights, the memories crept in. I would hear Cheryl's voice in my head sharp and belittling, and my chest would tighten. But then I'd play the recording not to relive the pain, but to remind myself that I had faced it, that I had survived it, that I had turned it into proof no one could deny. It became less a scar and more a reminder of my strength. By the end of that semester, I began to feel the difference between surviving and living. The weight of Cheryl's control was no longer pressing down on me every moment, and though the wounds she left would take years to fully heal, I finally had space to breathe. When I walked through campus, I lifted my head instead of keeping my eyes on the ground. I laughed louder without waiting for someone to tell me my voice was too much. I wore the clothes I liked, bright colors that once would have earned a scowl from Cheryl, and every time I caught my reflection, I smiled at the small rebellions I had reclaimed. I applied for a summer internship at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, the same hospital that had treated my father before he passed. When I received the acceptance letter, tears blurred the words on the page. It felt like closing a circle, like honoring him in the best way I knew how. I whispered a quiet promise that I would carry his memory not as a weapon like Cheryl had used, but as a source of strength. Rachel and I celebrated with milkshakes at a diner near campus, and for the first time in years, I sat in a booth without dread clawing at my chest. She raised her glass and said, "To freedom, Maddie. To the life you're building." I clinked mine against hers, the sweetness of the shake, mixing with the sweetness of that moment proof that I had carved something new out of the ashes. The world outside still carried Cheryl's shadow. I heard rumors of her losing her position at the gym, of people at church avoiding her calls of whispers that followed her wherever she went. It should have felt like victory, but mostly it felt like distance. Her downfall no longer defined me. My story wasn't about her anymore. It was about the choice I made to fight the courage to speak when silence had nearly destroyed me. For the first time in almost a decade, my life felt like mine again. 1 year later, I sat at a small cafe just off campus, the hum of conversation around me blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. My textbooks were stacked beside me, notes spread out across the table as I prepared for finals. The sun filtered through the wide windows, casting warm light across my pages, and for the first time I felt truly present in my own skin. I had scars, yes, but they were mine, not marks Cheryl could twist into shame. They were proof that I had endured and proof that I had chosen to fight. As I sipped my coffee, an older woman settled into the seat across from me. She looked tired, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse, but when her eyes met mine, there was a spark of recognition. "You're Madison, aren't you? The girl from court." My breath caught, unsure of what to say, but she leaned forward, her voice trembling. "I watched every word. I saw you stand there and tell the truth. And because of that, I found the courage to leave my husband." Her confession hit me harder than I expected. I stared at her, realizing that my story had become more than just survival. It had become a mirror for others, a small beacon that reminded them they weren't alone. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you. Without you, I might still be trapped." I reached across the table, gripping her hand, feeling the weight of her gratitude, the weight of connection. In that moment, I understood that breaking my silence hadn't just saved me. It had started a ripple that touched lives I would never fully know. When she left, I sat there for a long time, the echo of her words filling the quiet space inside me. My journey wasn't finished. Healing wasn't a destination, but a path I walked every day. Yet, for the first time, I no longer felt like I was walking it alone. After she left, I closed my notebook and stared out the cafe window at the busy street beyond. People hurried past carrying bags of groceries, laughing into phones, chasing children who darted ahead. Life moved on for everyone as it should, yet mine felt transformed by the simplest truth. I had faced the monster in my own house, and I had lived to tell the story. The world hadn't ended when I spoke up. In fact, it had only begun. Sometimes at night, I still heard Cheryl's voice in my dreams, sharp and accusing, trying to claw its way back into my present. But I woke each morning knowing she had no power left. Her downfall no longer defined me, and my mother's silence no longer chained me. Their choices were theirs. Mine was to keep moving forward. I poured myself into my internship at Parkland Hospital that summer, pushing wheelchairs, shadowing nurses, learning to listen to pain and respond with care. Every patient reminded me that wounds could heal, that strength often grew in the quiet aftermath of suffering. I found myself smiling more often, laughing with coworkers, feeling my life expand into spaces Cheryl could never touch. Still, I carried the past with me, not as baggage, but as a compass. It reminded me that silence is dangerous, that control disguised as love is still control, that the truth is worth the risk. Sometimes, when classmates or coworkers asked about my family, I hesitated, then told a version of the story that was both painful and freeing. Their eyes widened, their heads nodded, and I saw recognition, the knowledge that too many people carried their own versions of Cheryl at home. I ended my journal entry that night with a line that surprised even me. Sometimes saving yourself means letting go of those who should have saved you first. Writing it down felt like sealing a promise. The past would always be part of me, but it would never again define me. My story had started with silence, but it would continue with my voice. And I intended to use it. If you've stayed with me until now, you know this isn't just a story about me. It's about what happens when silence is forced on someone until it nearly destroys them. I carried Cheryl's voice in my head for years, each insult carving deeper, each rule stealing a little more of who I was. I thought that was all life would ever be, shrinking myself so she could feel bigger. But the moment that slap echoed across the parking lot and my watch recorded the truth, everything began to change. And I need to ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have risked everything to make your voice heard? Because here is the thing, silence doesn't protect us. Silence only protects the person hurting us. It took me almost a decade to realize that, and when I finally broke mine, I felt the ground shift under my feet. I wasn't just a girl Cheryl could drag around anymore. I was someone who could stand in court press play and force the world to listen. That power is not unique to me. It belongs to anyone who chooses to tell their story. I know many of you watching have faced your own versions of Cheryl. Maybe it wasn't a stepmother. Maybe it was a father, a brother, a boss, or even someone you once trusted to love you. Their methods might have been different words instead of hands, guilt instead of rules, but the goal was the same: control. If that resonates with you, if you've ever sat in a room praying for someone to speak up for you, then I hope my story tells you this. You are not alone, and your silence does not have to last forever. So let me pause here and ask you directly. Have you ever been in a moment where proof or courage or even one person believing you could have changed everything? Tell me in the comments, because your story matters, and it could be the voice someone else needs to hear. When I stood on those courthouse steps with the Texas sun burning down on me, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe before. Power can shift. For years, Cheryl convinced me that she held all the cards, that my only role was to obey, to endure, to accept. But the second her voice filled that courtroom captured by my watch, the balance tilted. She could deny, she could scream, she could spit venom in my direction, but the truth spoke louder than all of it. And here is what I want you to remember. Truth always finds a way to rise when we are brave enough to hold it up. I wonder how many of you watching this have ever doubted that your story mattered. Maybe you told yourself no one would listen. Maybe you were taught that keeping quiet was noble, that enduring made you strong. I thought the same things, but silence doesn't make you strong, it makes you invisible. And when you finally choose to speak, even if your voice shakes, even if your hands tremble, you discover that strength was there all along waiting for you. If my story leaves you with anything, let it be this: you do not owe your silence to anyone. Not to a family that twists love into control. Not to a community that praises appearances over truth. Not to the fear that whispers you cannot survive without obedience. You owe your voice to yourself and to every version of you that once sat in the dark wishing someone would fight back. Now, I have to ask, what would you do if you were me, standing in front of that judge with your abuser only feet away, daring you to stay quiet? Would you press play? Would you let the world hear what they always told you to hide? Drop your answer in the comments because your perspective matters, and I read every word. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. You never know whose silence you might help break. Even now, I replay the look on Cheryl's face when the judge's gavel came down. For so long, she carried herself like she was untouchable, like the world bent to her control. But when the evidence was played, when her own words turned into chains around her, the mask cracked. And here is what struck me most. It wasn't just my victory. It was a reminder that abusers thrive on silence, but they collapse under exposure. That moment belonged to every person who had ever told me they didn't believe me. Every neighbor who smiled at Cheryl in church, every stranger who looked away when she dragged me through a diner. They could ignore whispers. They could ignore bruises hidden under sleeves. But they couldn't ignore her voice threatening me in broad daylight. Proof changed everything. So I want to turn this towards you. Think about the stories you carry. Maybe no one has heard them. Maybe you've been told to bury them. But what if your voice could be the light for someone else sitting in the dark right now? What if your story could give someone the courage to walk away, to press record, to file that report, to save themselves? That is why I am asking you to speak, comment, share. Because the ripple effect is real. That woman I met in the cafe told me she left because she saw me stand in court. Imagine if your story could be the one that gives another person that same courage. I know it's scary, sis. I know it feels like shouting into a void sometimes. But look at this community right here, the one gathered around these stories. We are proof that voices connect, that pain can transform into power. And every time you type a comment, every time you share, you might be giving someone the strength that they didn't think they had. So let me ask you again, what would you have done if you were me? Pulled into that parking lot, slapped until blood rose to my lip with everyone pretending not to see. Would you stay silent, or would you fight? Write it below because your answer matters. When I think about what comes next, I no longer picture fear or endless struggle. I picture a map of possibilities. Each road is one I get to choose for myself, not one forced on me by someone else's control. And that choice is the real victory. I don't pretend that everything is fixed or that scars disappear overnight. Healing is not a straight line. Some days, I still flinch at loud voices, still second-guess my worth, still remember the sting of Cheryl's hand. But now, those memories no longer define me. They remind me of what I survived. They remind me that I kept walking when it would have been easier to collapse. And if I can do that, so can you. That is why I keep asking you to engage. Because engagement is not just numbers, not just views or likes. It's proof that these stories matter, that they land in the hearts of real people who care. When you click, like when you subscribe, when you share this story, you help it travel further than I could ever imagine. Maybe it reaches a teenager in Ohio who thinks she has no way out. Maybe it reaches a grandfather in Florida who realizes his granddaughter is going through something similar. Maybe it reaches someone at exactly the moment they need to hear that survival is possible. So I'm asking for your help. Keep this chain alive. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Tap like if this resonated with you. Share it with someone who might need it more than you know. And most importantly, add your voice. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me your age, your city, your thoughts. Let this not be a one-way street but a conversation. Because together we can turn a single story into a movement, and a movement into real change. I promise you this, every comment I read feels like a hand on my shoulder, reminding me I'm not alone. And if it does that for me, imagine what it can do for someone else scrolling through someone wondering if they should walk away from their own Cheryl. Let them see your courage. Let them see your truth. Together, we can make sure silence no longer protects the abuser and stories no longer stay hidden. This is not the end of my story, it's just the start of something bigger. And with your help, it can be the start of someone else's freedom too. So go ahead, make your presence known. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Let's build a circle of voices too loud to be ignored.